All right. Happy Monday, everyone. And welcome to today's session of using your brewery's production data to evaluate finances, COGS, product traceability, and KPIs. Huge shout out to Andrew Copeland and a huge thank you to him and the craft beer professionals community for setting up should be awesome, another virtual conference. So, yeah, let's go from there. And today's session is going to be really cool because we're actually going to be diving in on finances and COGS. And as everybody knows, people who have met me before, it's a very unique topic that I love and enjoy sharing on. So with that, let's get going. So I want to start off with a quick introduction. My name is Pulkit K, Agrawal, also go by PK. I am the founder and CEO of The Fifth Ingredient. We have the software system called Beer 30 that is currently being used in over 450 breweries across 22 countries, I believe. And it's been really cool. We have breweries as little as 70 barrels all the way up to 65, 70,000 barrels using the system. And my quick backstory is that I studied mechanical engineering at Harvard University and then was recruited to work at Ballast Point Brewing in San Diego as a process engineer. Did that for a few years. So really, I'm intimate when it comes to packaging equipment, nitrogen production. And then in December of 2022, I was also added in as part of the Forbes 30 under 30 Food and Drink 2023 category for the work done with The Fifth Ingredient. So real quick, one of the questions that we always get is, what is the fifth ingredient? And well, the answer to that is the four ingredients in beer: water, malt, hops, yeast. And the fifth ingredient is data. And everything that happens here always revolves around what we can do with data to actually help breweries. And so today in our session, what we're going to be really focusing in on to start off with is that beer is not a fixed widget. This is a core principle that I want everybody to look at, whether they're accountants, whether they're brewers, whether they're on the sales side, that beer is not a fixed widget. Then we're going to get into a few guiding questions for this session. So Q1, where do I start tracking data? And in particular, we're going to use this to focus in on three areas of data management and really dive in on the issues that happen. Q2 is going to be, how do I organize the data? And with this, we're really going to focus in on three steps of brewery analytics. Q3 ends up being, what does organized data look like? And we're actually going to go back and revisit our three areas of data management, but this time showcase it with solutions. Question 4 is going to be WTF data, numbers equal profits. And I'm actually going to give 6 areas of profit analysis that we really think that breweries should be looking at when it comes to understanding the health of their business or where areas to actually help improve their overall profitability. Finally, we're going to get into some key performance indices, some KPIs, and then from there, dive in on takeaways and next steps. So really, that's what today's 45-minute session is going to be all about. And so this should be super exciting. So first thing, beer is not a fixed widget. What that really means is that beer is constantly changing during fermentation. Usually when you think of something like a fixed widget, you're thinking about buying particular items, right? Like, oh, I'm buying a t-shirt. I'm buying items such as packaging supplies or ingredients like grains. Those could be considered fixed widgets. But in this case, because beer is constantly changing during fermentation, the yield changes because of yeast health. Right? If you have a batch where there's actually a really good yeast happening, very healthy yeast, versus a very poor performing yeast, that's going to have an impact on your flavor, the taste, all the other details that tie in with yields. And so it's always a living, breathing product, a living, breathing item. You can also take a base beer and split it up into different varieties of flavored beers, right? So I can go ahead and take my base IPA, split that up across pineapple, habanero, mango, whatever flavors I want. And now all of a sudden, we've taken that quote unquote first widget or item that was there and actually split it up. And so with that, beer is not a fixed widget because it's always changing, where you can add in different ingredients and actually change the overall beer that's there. And so with that, one of the key aspects of this is that at each step of those splits and merges, you want to make sure that you're tracking your COGS or your cost of goods sold. For those of you who don't know what COGS are, we're going to be doing a deep dive on that in a few slides, but the quick summary is that cost of goods sold refer to just how much it costs to make this particular beer. And so that's really going to tie in as well, where as you take a base beer and split that up into different varieties, the cost of goods and the cost to make that beer are always changing. And with that, on the beer is not a fixed widget side, Well, supply chain changes are always happening, and that leads to different inputs from a changing market. And really, with that, when we look even to present day, raw materials and packaging supplies were not what they were pre-pandemic, but they're also not what they were a year ago, right? And we know that the next couple months are very uncertain in a lot of ways. We see that with breweries on the day-to-day, we see that with costs increasing. And so really understanding that even raw materials and packaging supplies are inputting into those entire costs. And so that also has a huge impact on what's going on. So again, it's not a fixed stationary widget that's always the same. And this particular message is for CEOs, CFOs, and in general, anybody that's making a leadership decision at a brewery, is that always remember that there are levers that you actually have to pull. And with that, keep in mind that you own the manufacturing process. And what that means is even if you're a contract brewing facility, for example, or a brewery that has all their production happening at contract facilities, you still own the manufacturing process because you're in charge of whichever company you're going to use to actually build out or brew your beer. And so with that, never assume that brewers are doing the best job that they could, right? And that's a key difference here is that instead of looking at it from a perspective of stories, actually look at the data and see how you can get better yields and more output. And with that, never assume that you have the best rates for raw materials and packaging supplies. Look at your finances and investigate better contract renegotiations. And always remember that investing in efficiency and software can have massive yield increases for output. And so that's really where the core ideas here come in that no matter what you're doing, looking at the actual data, looking at the contracts, understanding efficiency, and even using something like Beer 30 or other software can really help optimize for those yields and understanding the efficiency side. So with that, let's actually get into what's the definition of a brewery's health, right? And there's three key factors that we really emphasize here, which are quality, efficiency, and sales. And the core aspect with this is that complacency kills a brewery. And when we actually break this down into the three areas, you have quality, where at this point, if you make beer that doesn't taste that great, somebody's just going to go down the street to another brewery, right? And so with quality, you want to make sure that you keep customers happy. With efficiency, what you really want to focus on is instead of actually buying more tanks or buying more equipment, is there a way that you can actually optimize the current system to get more output in the same time or with the same exact equipment? Right? This is critical, where many times people are saying, well, we need more tanks because we need to do more fermentation. Well, that's awesome and that's a good problem to have. But at the same time, have you really maxed out all of your current tanks and optimized it where you are getting the full output that you can get from your tank farm? And if not, maybe worth focusing on the efficiency and yield side prior to getting in on buying more equipment. And then finally, we get into the sales side. And at this point, well, you can sell all the beer that you want, but if you're not growing your profit margins, things are going to stagnate and you're probably going to go out of business if you're not actually letting the revenue and the actual profit increase while your costs are also changing. So again, complacency kills a brewery in the three key areas where we really emphasize this: quality, efficiency, and sales. So now we start looking at, well, what are the actual levers that you have, or what do you actually do with all this information and data? So question one really comes down to where do I start tracking data? And really the key here is that we're all trained to capture data in notes on paper, spreadsheets, whiteboards, but it can be really overwhelming to understand how to use that data, right? And actually, more importantly, how do we use that data to make a profit? And so this is a core fundamental that so many breweries are actually struggling with when you look at the fact that they're not really doing an analysis as to where their data is showing that entire story. And so what I'm hoping is that from today's session, you're able to take the tools that I'm giving to actually go back into your brewery's data sets and see how you can actually make a difference. And so with that, we start getting into the three areas of data management. And this is really where you focus in on the issues that are happening at your brewery. And so in this case, with those three areas, we're going to look at those key fundamentals of process inefficiencies, high process cost, and poor quality and inconsistency. So again, continuing on with the theme that for a brewery, Complacency ties in three key areas: quality, efficiency, and sales and profitability. And so we're getting into process inefficiencies, process costs, and quality and inconsistency. You can do the same exercise with many different areas of data management for your breweries. This is just an example to showcase how to actually utilize information. So with this on the inefficiency side, well, number one, production planning issues with tanks that are sitting empty or full for extra days. You have redundant paper logs, whiteboards, end of shift emails, and spreadsheets. How often is it that you're sending a text message and then you're having a paper log that you're then sending an end of shift email for? It's just very redundant that's happening back and forth. Or there's extra hours that are being spent on brewing, filtering, or packaging just because of downtime or inefficiencies in the system. Each of those inefficiencies has an actual dollar value associated with it from a cost perspective. So the next area is high process costs. And so with this, delayed reactions to issues as they arise: brew, ferment, filter, bright tank, package, yeast, right? Being in a position, for example, where as you're actually looking at the fermentation side, not being able to understand just how your fermentation is actually performing to be able to be proactive about it. The extra costs that happen for grains, hops, cans, bottling supplies, or also having unknown costs of goods sold per product, right? There's many breweries that I'm familiar with where they actually didn't know their cost of goods per product before they started using Beer 30 because it was just some estimation across spreadsheets or purchase orders. But being able to really break it down on a per product, per SKU level is a very big issue that you need to address. From a quality and consistency side, we get into destroying a tank that is out of specification, right? If something isn't up to spec and you have to dump beer down the drain, that's painful for both the brewer, but also painful for the owner because that's a financial hit. Customers, if they go unhappy, they just go to a different brewery, or your brand reputation is getting tarnished, right? And so all things that tie in with happiness levels and brand reputation, and just the fact that if you open up a beer, you want it to always be the same quality, the same taste. And so that all ties in from a quality standpoint. So with that, let's jump into number two. How do I actually organize this data? And so with that, we actually started looking at the key principle that feedback from the data should really drive the business decisions. And what this means is that data management impacts daily operations, where if you have poor data management, it's going to be time consuming and difficult. And if you have good data management, then it's going to be fast and clear. And so really the importance of this becomes an importance of power as well as flexibility, where at the end of the day, knowledge is power, and really understanding what's going on when it comes to the data side gives you that power to make decisions and actually have a lot of flexibility. And so the question that comes often is, well, you have all this data, how do you organize it? And with that, there's three key steps that we've come up with for brewery analytics. And so really it comes down together with collecting the data, transforming the data, and then using that data for prediction. So again, collection, transformation, and prediction. And so what that means is as you track as much data as possible on the process side, so collect all the data, brew, ferment, filter, bright tank, package, yeast, really understand what's happening when it comes to estimations versus exact readings, and then validate the instruments they use to measure. Right, this is super critical, where if you have, for example, a pH meter, you want to make sure that you're going through and actually checking, making sure that the pH meter is calibrated for acid, for bases, for neutral, to make sure that it's always getting the exact data that you need. Right, so all these aspects tie in with just collecting the data and making sure that it's accurate based off of validation. From there, we get into transformation, where you then take all that data that's there and organize it into tables, rows, and columns. And with that, we're people that actually enjoy visual representations, right? So then you start taking those rows, columns, spreadsheets, and you start actually graphing it out and having visual representation. And so the key with this is that that visualization could be done by a software like the Beer 30 charting tool, or it can be done in Excel or Google Sheets, right? But the key is you're actually showing some sort of visual representation. We also have some breweries that actually have a graph paper that's on their tanks, or I've seen breweries like this, and then they'll use a little pencil grid to make X's for gravities and fermentation, right? So breweries can do that as well. And so being able to utilize that and having that visualization is critical to understand how things are going. And then from there, as part of the data, you want to make sure that you're looking at both accuracy and precision to make sure that each data point is valid and going as expected. So it ties in nicely from a transformation perspective as well. From there, we get into the third area of analytics, which is prediction. And so with prediction, you really want to use the past data to make inferences on future events, right? And this becomes critical to understand really what's happening when it comes to success metrics and being able to compare data points to the standards. And with that, you know what the gold standard of your beer is, right? From a quality perspective, you know that this IPA should always taste this way, or this lager should taste this way. And so all of that ties in from a prediction component of being able to see, well, is the beer that's sitting in fermentation, how far is it going to deviate from that gold standard? And with that, you're actually focusing in on those tolerances and you're validating it real time in each brew. Where if, for example, on the mash pH side, things aren't as great as you think that they would be, well, it's time to really start looking at whatever that tolerance delta is and going from there to notice what's happening on the next steps for that particular brew. So with that, we get into question 3. What does organized data look like? Right? And that really comes in with the areas of data management, but this time diving in with solutions. And so we're actually able to look at those examples and processes. And let's actually go back to those 3 key areas that I've mentioned about efficiency, quality, and profitability. And so in this case, what that looks like is that you have improved efficiencies, you've decreased your process cost, and you've improved your quality and consistency. And with that, examples of this look like, well, A, you're maximizing your tank and equipment utilization, right? You're avoiding buying more equipment because that's a huge capital expense. And instead, you're focused in on what you can do from the current existing tanks and the equipment that's present. You're having real-time process reports. So instead of getting into something where you're looking at it weeks later or a couple days later, you're actually getting real-time alerts. People are notifying you, or the software system you're using is notifying you real time. And if you do have a central source of truth like Beer 30, you're able to then streamline communication by removing redundant paperwork. And realistically, if you are using any other system as a whole, figure out ways to get those real-time text and email alerts, right? Get those elements where if a beer is not within spec, that you're actually proactively monitoring, which really leads to the decreased process costs. Where if you're proactively monitoring process outputs, downtime, scheduling, real-time alerts, they all go in together with using data properly to actually help your brewery as a whole. And with that, as you start getting into this, looking at ways to improve your recipes to optimize ingredients, right? Maybe you need less hops in a beer because you're actually adding in a different adjunct instead, right? So ways to actually optimize to decrease your overall recipe cost. And then with that, the best way to decrease something, well, like I said earlier, knowledge is power. And you have to know what the exact COGS for each beer are, or otherwise you're not going to be able to look at optimizations. And so really knowing the exact COGS all tie in together from a process perspective. From there, we get into quality and consistency. And so the first thing is that when you really break it down, each batch of beer probably has over 300 plus data points, right? And that ties in with everything from ingredients, the quantities being used, to the actual brewing process, each day in fermentation. Maybe you're filtering or transferring the beer. Maybe you're adding in some bright tank ingredients, carving up the tank, all the way to the packaging side. Is it ready to package? Packaging process data during the run. Maybe you're using a C-box, or maybe you're using a Zamenagel and checking that out. To then finished product, and the finished product text from a quality perspective. Maybe you're throwing in their sensory. Maybe you're getting there into like yeast analysis and moving yeast into different components of the beer or other beers. That's over 300 data points realistically. And at that point, if you're properly tracking that, the key is to, again, make sure that you're ensuring that customers have consistently high quality beer that they're drinking. And because of that, it'll be repeatable. and that product ensures that brand loyalty. So always making sure that you have that set up from both the quality and consistency perspective. So from there we get into Q4, which is, well, WTF data, numbers equal profits. And this is probably one of my favorite areas of the system. So now that you have a better understanding of data, let's look at 6 areas in a brewery as examples where you can use the numbers to do a profit analysis. And so with that, that comes into process optimization, quality control, inventory and material resource planning MRP, cost of goods sold, COGS, sales and distribution, and then time savings across the team. And realistically, all of this that you're doing from a data perspective really comes down to 2 key principles that we really believe in at the fifth ingredient, which is brew more and brew better. And so everything with data should really come back to those key principles and questions. Am I using this information to actually brew more? And am I using this information to brew better? So let's actually start breaking down these 6 examples. So number 1, process optimization. So examples of this are improving and controlling the brew to package yield, and really looking at the results that happen of increased output per batch, which realistically, if you're getting more beer out per batch, you're also reducing the cost of goods per barrel, hectoliter, or liter, right? Because you're actually being more efficient when it comes to the overall cost for the beer, because even though the same ingredients went into the tank, you're actually getting more beer out at the other end. With that, being able to track, chart, and identify variances and improvement in 3 key areas, which really come together in brewhouse efficiency, filtration, transfer, and yield, and then packaging yield as well. Right? So those are like 3 key performance indices as a whole, and we'll talk about this later, but really getting into brewhouse efficiency, the elements of what goes into the fermentation vessels, what then goes from fermentation into packaging or bright tanks, and then what's actually finished and packaged off. So all areas for optimization for the entire story. From there, we actually look into, well, what do we do to actually minimize tank turn time? And this really is a key principle that results in increased overall fermentation cellar capacity. So if you're watching this and you're thinking about, well, you have all this space, what can you do to actually keep the process going of the overall capacity? Really use this as a way to think about what that maximum capacity is. And if you ever want to talk more about that for your cellar, feel free to reach out. I'll have details at the end to get a hold of me. But really, that all ties in with eliminating and deferring the need for further capital investment in tanks. And so again, if you're able to get more out of your current tanks, the better the system's going to be. From there, analyzing and understanding key fermentation metrics. So in this case, for example, optimizing cellar schedules, streamlining recipe variations based off of fermentation trends, and that ties in with daily gravities, daily pH, temperature, and even looking at things like VDK, right? And so one of the cool things about this whole process optimization side, it's actually one of our case studies of how Pelican Brewing out of Oregon, they're doing about 50,000 barrels. So for those of you internationally, that's roughly a little over 5 million liters, 5.5 million liters. And so in that case, what they were able to do was Pelican actually used Beer 30 Labs to optimize production and drive a 550,000 US dollars increase in annual sales, right? And regardless of whatever software you're using, whether you're in spreadsheets, whether you're in a different competitor, the key is of using the data. And here's some key areas that Pelican did, which was that they, 1, increased average brewhouse volume output per batch by 15% by looking at the data. This then resulted in an increase in average fermentation fill from 185 barrels to 205 barrels, right? So that's 20 more barrels per tank that's happening on every single turn for their flagship beers. But at the same time, because they started looking at their data and process optimizing, they were actually able to reduce the fermentation time before cold crashing from an average of 14 days to 8 days for ales and from 30 days to 15 days for lagers, right? So if you're looking at that, that's almost decreasing your entire tank turnaround time by about 50% on its own, right? Because if you had a lager that was sitting there for 30 days and now you're getting it done in 15, well, that's clearly telling you some aspect about this, right? And so with that really ties in, well, if you're able to reduce that tank turn time, you're able to increase your total cellar capacity. Now, that's all happening on the brewing and fermentation side. And then one of the other key principles that they did was also focusing in on the average overall yield from brew to package by 12%. Where even if you're keeping your packaging lines the exact same, the fact that you have more liquid that you're able to package off can actually increase that brew to package side. And because of those increases in yields, the average COGS decreased by about $15 to $20 per barrel. And with those 6 examples or those 6 changes that happened, they were able to actually add beer production, and that added beer production enabled an increase of 550,000 US dollars in sales over the span of 1 year because now they have that beer that they didn't have before. So this is a key example. And I know there's people that are watching this that are saying, well, that's happening. Those numbers are happening because it's a really big production facility. Well, even in a small production facility, let's say you have a 20 barrel brew house, the same logic applies where you're looking at what's going on at those levels of being able to understand, well, are you maximizing your tank fills? Are you looking at the actual turnaround times? Are you looking at the overall yields? And so this becomes super critical in the overall workflow of what's going on. From there, we start getting into number 2 on the quality control side. And so what that means is actually looking at ways of quality validation and quality control. So this really ties in with real-time alerts and sign-offs at every step of the process. And really what you're looking at with that is identifying and mitigating costly production mistakes before they move further down the process and consume additional materials, time, and tank spaces. So pretty much what that looks like is, well, if you have a beer that is kind of faulty already on the fermentation side, do you really want to spend all that time and energy putting that beer into bottles or kegs only to have to dump it or put a product recall in place? So really at each step of the process, the areas of sign off should really be brew finish, ready to filter, and ready to package. And any software system that you're working with should really focus in on these 3 key areas of quality control. With that, being able to track the yeast pitch and harvesting and propagation data and yeast genealogy from batch to batch, yeast becomes one of those aspects where you're able to really maximize repitching generations and minimize the fresh pitch cost if you're really using this from a quality control perspective. As we keep going down from quality, we start looking at aspects of proactive validation on the brew day. Where, as you can see here from this brew sheet in Beer 30, the key principle behind this is setting target tolerances for each critical brewing spec, providing user instant feedback, and assigning an intuitive coloring system based on deviation from the target value of green, yellow, and red, and having real-time alerts to other team members via text and email. Right? Imagine you're traveling. Imagine you're not at the brewery production floor today. And if there is a particular beer that isn't within spec, you'd like to get alerted about that real time, right? And so that way you can see how to properly fix it. And so that's where the red, yellow, green becomes so critical as you're actually looking at that proactive validation on the brew side as an example. We then get into fermentation. On the fermentation side, examples of this really look like, hey, like what's happening on my gravities? Are my temperatures within spec? Again, red and yellow. And really doing more with your tank sheets where you actually start graphing out those key metrics. And like I said, you can even use graph paper if you're not really interested in using a software system. And really from the good data management, you then start visualizing each batch on top of one another. So for example, if we do predictive analysis in gravities, you're able to really observe gravity on a daily basis and graph it out. And you could have this analysis where there's a really tight spread with gravities and day numbers. In this example, my gravity is 1069, and notice how it's so tight and consistent, and you're hitting those metrics. But if I were to look at those same 6 beers from a pH perspective, well, we know that beer pH is actually a flavor number for beer. And if you do this analysis, notice how wide that pH is from 5.1 to 5.9. And that could really result in inconsistent beer because of that wide range of data. And so you have to take actions to fix it. And so this is a core example of how actually using the data for prediction and actually using it results in a brewery, for example, one of our customers that realized that the water coming into from the city was changing. right? And so we know that water fluctuates, and because water fluctuates seasonally, maybe there's more snow that's causing, for example, the Colorado River to have more liquid in it, or maybe there's a drought. It results in different aspects of the water, which then results in water chemistry and results in pHs changing. So very critical to be able to look at all that, how those pieces tie in together. From there, number 3, inventory and MRP. So you use the data to improve your material resource planning, MRP, and you develop a just-in-time purchasing materials and just-in-time purchasing process for raw materials and packaging supplies. And this is really critical. When you get into that just-in-time, if possible, you really minimize your cash flow and the warehouse space that's tied up in excess inventory, right? If I'm not using a particular ingredient for 6 months and I know that I can get it just a week out, well, why would I order it and have it sit in my warehouses for 5 months and 3 weeks when I know that I don't need it until then, right? I'm not using my cash effectively. And at that point, the warehouse space is just tied up with ingredients that aren't being used. And at the same time, being able to minimize the losses that happen with raw materials that expire, right? Maybe you do have ingredients that are going to go out of code, and at that point, you just have to throw them away. Or maybe on the packaging side, you're actually able to look at minimizing the losses with material that needs to get phased out or seasonal brands. And that really happens where maybe you ended up purchasing so many more labels for a particular seasonal beer. Maybe it's an Oktoberfest beer. Maybe it's a winter beer based off of a particular holiday. And at that point, if you don't package everything out, that's just extra labels that are going to have to be thrown away. And so as you start looking at optimization, that's really where something like material resource planning becomes so critical. And really, here's an example from Beer 30 where you're able to actually make accurate purchase decisions to ensure that operations are running smoothly while keeping your cash flow in check. And being able to really plan out what's happening weeks, months in advance, and knowing just based on lead times and stock on hand when you need to order particular ingredients. Number 4, cost of goods sold, right? And so really using the data to calculate exact COGS for each brand and packaging type. And then really the key with this is that you gain visibility into profitability for each SKU that the brewery sells, right? The amount of cost that goes into doing a 24-pack of bottles could be very different than 24-pack of cans, could be very different than half-barrel kegs and sixtels, right? And so being able to understand COGS all ties in together from a profitability side. And really you're able to then identify the individual SKUs which have that high cost and theoretically could have the opportunities to reduce costs with recipe optimization, adjust prices to ensure an attractive margin. And really, as you start tracking COGS from batch to batch, you're constantly identifying shifts in COGS over time, and you're using that to adapt purchasing, operations, and pricing strategies. Again, going way back to our initial slides, it was all tying in with, well, what do you have when you never assume that the brewers are working as efficiently or as optimally as you'd like. You look at the data, and you always assume that you can look at your actual contracts and see what the prices are. And so with those aspects, you're able to really understand what the variances are and the percentage of variances from the target COGS to the actual COGS that are happening for that batch. And so with that, we get into things like, well, on the process improvement side, I'm actually able to use my batch costing as efficiency metrics and really able to understand for grains, hops, adjuncts, yeast, packaging supplies, labor and rentals, and then really being able to include final landed cost of all items, including shipping and taxes. And this becomes really critical to understanding from a COGS perspective. And what I really like showing when I talk about COGS is this particular slide from Black Ops Brewery, one of our Beer 30 customers, and they actually did a full online blog on the top 11 lessons of building a brewery and navigating the valley of death. And really in that assessment for COGS, looking at things like the labor for brewing, labor for packaging, overall overhead, yeast, and even taxes, all tying in definitely for the exact cost of goods side. So again, hoping that you're able to move on from this presentation with changes that you can actually implement at your brewery for better visibility. With that, we get into cost of goods per batch. So now you start looking at it where in this example, a 24 pack of this beer is 15.28 in bottles, 24 pack of this beer in cans is 11.41, and my half barrel kegs are 92.84. So again, very clearly showing that each SKU has a different cost of goods sold. Then I take it from the batch level and I actually show the COGS per brand. And so what's really cool about this slide is that I'm able to showcase that between my runs, I had some aspects of this brown sugar ale, batch number 11, that had those bottles at 15.28, but my batch 12 actually had it at 9.44. So being able to understand what's happening on a cost of goods per brand, and then realistically realizing that your cost of goods per brand for your lager is probably going to be very different than your double hop IPA, right? And so being able to understand what that looks like to then take it a step further with actual variance reports and actually comparing those targets versus actuals to understand just how things are deviating over time and the percentage of changes that are happening. Where now I know that one of my beers is 15% more expensive than I thought it would be. From there, we get into number 5, which dives in with sales and distribution and really understanding of how you can use real-time brewery inventory to showcase to team members what exactly is there in stock and when beers are coming available. And with this, you're able to really understand stock numbers, understand availability, understand what's going on to really make sure that your sales team never misses a sales opportunity. And you're really using that to focus on minimizing overcommitments with back orders and really using the data to focus on transitions and trends between seasonality and limited release beers. And so with that, as you really go down that process improvement rabbit hole, the key here is also to look at traceability. And what that looks like is understanding for each ingredient the lot numbers of each raw material, understanding what you do in case there's ever a product recall, and also making sure that you have that consistent quality metrics. From there, from a product traceability side, you really want to look at the entire loop from grain to glass for true traceability, from scheduling and test to raw materials and yeast, material traceability, packaging materials, batch costing, understanding distribution and sales, sales traceability, and even keg tracking, and being able to understand what that all looks like from a batch history perspective and a product recall perspective as well. And the key here is that as you start thinking about that growth strategy, continue to keep thinking about mitigating those operational risks, right? Because as your distribution grows and your footprint grows, there are definitely going to be other issues that come up from an operations and quality side. So again, always focus on that brew more, brew better mentality because you want to know what's going on from a traceability perspective. From there, we get into batch codes. And the key thing that I love emphasizing with batch codes is that for each sales order, make sure to incorporate the exact batch number and where it went onto that truck, because then you know where each brand and batch was then sold in the market. So very critical from a batch code perspective as well. And finally, number 6, from a profitability side, right? Time savings across the team. So consolidate your multiple spreadsheets, paper sheets, email daily digest into a central source of truth. And use a brewery software. And if you're not going to use a software like Beer 30, at least create pivot tables or use Google Sheets where everything is interconnected. Right? If you're at that level in Excel or Google Sheets, make it happen, but interconnect everything so it's not just living independently in the entire supply chain. Use the data to work productively with task management and real-time alerts as changes happen in the brewery. And then use the data and numbers to look at ways to optimize time savings with pre-bill sheets and tax reporting. For example, on our end, we give the Brewers Report of Operations, or in Australia and New Zealand, we have a 2-click New Zealand or Australian excise tax report that's generated by clicking the start date and end date. Right? And really the whole purpose here is to avoid the redundancies in the system. So with that, as we kind of move forwards in the session, we then start looking at KPIs and key performance indices. And so with that, really the question that I always get is, well, what is a KPI? And a KPI is a quantifiable measure of performance over time for a specific objective. So the key here is that it's quantifiable. You're looking at it over time and you have a particular objective that you're trying to solve. And when you take that step back, the what and the why, it really comes down to that in a brewery, you're really setting these metrics and goals up in 4 key areas: process quality, operations and people, marketing, and sales. And one of the things that I'll point out is that I hear from, even on the CBP threads, people are saying, well, we're too small for a brewery to have KPIs, or you don't really believe in it. And we'll talk about that because no matter what you're looking at, we're going to look into how to actually set these metrics up for your brewery and then evaluating really what does success look like and how to improve those results, right? And when we actually break this down for examples of KPI at a brewery, we then start seeing that a lot of these are metrics that you're already tracking if you're running a business, hopefully, especially if you're running a successful business. So examples of this at a brewery are minutes per brew, knowing how many barrels or liters are brewed, knowing how many barrels or liters are packaged, understanding that brew to package yield ratio, understanding yeast health, understanding sensory true to brands, how often is your beer actually true to brand, understanding the gravity and pH of different beers, diving in on dissolved oxygen and CO2 levels, breaking down ABV, alcohol by volume percentages, IBUs, colors. Number 10, cash flow, one of the most critical KPIs in a business. Scheduling changes, and then tank residency time. Then we get into things like on-hand inventory numbers. And really, since we're breaking this down well beyond the entire brewing operations and as a whole for a brewery, getting into things like marketing conversion, finished goods, cost per liter, barrel, or gallon, sales, getting into projected versus actual, and then really account days on hand. So again, 18 KPIs that are examples for you to start thinking about, and really then realizing from there that, well, with this information, we actually want to set up team meetings for departments. Getting into a bi-weekly meeting per department, process and quality, operations and people, marketing, sales, and really using that to track results. And for these results, setting an agenda and outlining the areas that need improvement or aren't hitting targets, and then begin root cause analysis to dive in on issues and start making those changes and track weekly results. So with this, a lot of times understanding what root cause analysis is very important and very critical. So a good example of this is really understanding what is the problem and then going through the exercise of 5 whys to then say, well, here's the problem. Why is it happening? Well, why is that happening? Why is that happening? Why is that happening? And ultimately getting to the root cause behind things. So here's an example from my time at Ballast Point where we were seeing an increase in losses on the keg line. And the problem was, well, we have an increase in losses on the keg line. So then we start getting into the whys behind this. Well, why are we seeing an increase in losses? Well, we're overfilling our kegs. Well, why are we overfilling our kegs? Well, we're increased the foaming somehow. Well, why is there an increase in foaming? Well, the fill speeds on the keg line are variable. Well, why are the fill speeds on the keg line variable? Well, there's a valve that's being used to regulate this, and it's not opening or closing as expected. So the action is to then replace the control valve for slow and fast fill. So we actually start breaking down those KPIs in details to understand the why behind things. From there, again, that question that comes up, am I too small for KPIs? And the answer is no. If you've been brewing, you've been tracking those KPIs, right? Those examples could be gravities, pH, temperatures. Those can all turn into KPIs where you track how often you hit those targets. Where, for example, this month out of 20 brews, 18 of them hit the target pH during knockout, right? That tells you that 18 out of 20, you had 90% success. So no brewery is too small. No brewery is quote unquote too corporate, or brewers that think that they would start implementing KPIs now become too corporate. Doesn't make sense because it all comes down to running a business effectively and profitably. And so finally, so we wrap up, we start looking at the takeaways and next steps. And so really the takeaways in this entire thing is remember that beer is not a fixed widget. To get started, look at the 3 areas of data management and really break down at your brewery, what do you think are the 3 big issues that you're facing? Organize that data into different steps of brewery analytics. Review the organized data and start looking at it from a solutions perspective. Start breaking down the data for profitability, and there's 6 areas that we went over, all based off of what 2 hashtags of brew better beer and brew more beer. And really the final aspect of what actions can I take today? want to definitely recommend taking a look at brewery data management solutions. Really, at the end of the day, the 4 key areas you want in a system are purchasing of raw materials and inventory, understanding production management, sales, and then the accounting side. And out there, you have Beer 30, Ecos, Encompass Orchestra, Crafted ERP, Brew Ninja, Ollie Vicinity, many more that come to mind. But also keep in mind that you don't have to switch full stack from a system, right? And you can use something like Beer 30 Labs and Ecos, or Beer 30 Labs and Orchestrated Beer and Encompass, Beer 30 Labs and Unleashed and Deer as well. So again, if you're interested in learning more about Beer 30, feel free to reach out to me. We also have different methods of accounting syncing, APAR, general ledgers, so make your accountant love you and pick the path that works best for your business. With that, if there are any questions, feel free to add them into the comments. Shoot me an email, pk@thefifthingredient.com. Visit our website, thefifthingredient.com, where you can book a free demo of Beer 30 or Beer 30 Labs. We'll also do a free ROI calculation for you, especially to really understand how the actual costs for implementation look like. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn, social media at The Fifth Ingredient, and thank you to Andrew Copeland and the Craft Beer Professionals community. This is going to be a really cool week with some other sessions that are happening, so make sure to tune in for those, and definitely see you all at CBC in person. We'll have a booth, and looking forward to coming by the event that CBP is doing at Jackalope, and it's going to be great. So if there are any questions, feel free to shoot them in the comments or shoot me a note afterwards. Cool. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.